Hope you had a good break. Managed to visit the facilities wherever you may be. I'd like to again just put a good thank you together for Mark Johnson, Sherry Ann, Therese Keys, and Paula Blanc with the previous presentations on the climate change assessment theme. Again, they were great. I fully enjoyed them. We're now going to move on to the next theme, which is climate change planning and management. And we've got three speakers who will be presenting on that here today. The first will be Deanna Stralberg, who's a researcher on climate change with the Canadian Forest Service. The second will be Juha Metsaranta. I'll let him fix the butchering instead of his name, who's a research scientist on forest carbon and climate change with Canadian Forest Service. And then we'll have a short break for our lunch, and then we'll continue on with Jacob Oleniski, who will be presenting after lunch as well. So, at any rate, I will turn this over to Deanna. Do you want to start sharing, and then I'll be quiet here in the background.
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Hudson. I will just share my screen and presentation mode. Is that going well then? I trust you can see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So thanks very much for the invitation. My name's Deanna Stralberg. I'm a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. I've been here for about a year now. I was previously at the University of Alberta, and I'm still an adjunct there. And I'm a landscape ecologist, which means I make a lot of maps. So I would suggest that if you can put your screen, if you can maximize the screen, that might allow you to see some of my slides a little bit better. And so the topic of my talk today is on what we're calling climate change refugia, or areas of relative resistance to climate change, and what the implications are for forest management. And so I acknowledge that really I'm here to kind of give some general ideas, but you all as the practitioners are the ones that will really, know more about the specifics. So I make this presentation with all humility. And so my first slide here, it was really to make the point that the IPCC's warning about climate change, their language has gotten increasingly strong and clear about the effects of human activities on the climate system. And I think you all know that, but it's making the case that we really need to, no matter what happens with a country's pledges to reduce emissions, that we need to start thinking about adaptation. But I did want to use this graph as an opportunity to note that, we're looking at scenarios in this higher end of the emission range, or the greenhouse gas concentration range. And some of my projections, and indeed a lot of the projections that have been done, are really focusing on this higher end, which are increasingly considered more of a worst case scenario, fortunately, as we reduce, reliance on coal. And so we're looking probably more around this 4.5 scenario. But in any case, it's, likely that we're looking at more than 2 degrees increase. And so we need to plan for that. And so here in Alberta, because the Western boreal forest is close to a moisture deficit threshold, Alberta is particularly vulnerable to not just forest change, but forest loss. And so bioclimatic models suggest this eventual widespread replacement of boreal forest climate conditions, which are shown in the darker green colors in this map produced by Rick Schneider. And the replacement of these boreal conditions with warmer and drier parkland and prairie conditions. I only went through 2050s here, but if you look at more extreme scenarios up through the 2080s, it's really more prairie climates entering the boreal region. And this is not because of decreased precipitation necessarily, but more because of because of higher evaporative demands and more prevalent drought conditions. And so we can show this through a variety of bioclimatic modeling approaches for ecoregions as well as individual species. My own work has done some work modeling bird distributional responses to climate change. And so these negative effects of drought can already be seen on tree growth, and especially for white spruce. And these impacts have already been documented. This shows some results by my colleague Ted Hogg at CFS for a network of Alberta sites with high sensitivity to climatic moisture, reduced growth rates. And then more recently, and Juha will probably talk about this effort as well, there's been an assembly of tree ring data across the boreal region that has also allowed folks to look at the sensitivity of tree growth to soil moisture. And of course, there's fairly high sensitivity in the West in particular. So we're starting to see these effects. And then, of course, when drought is combined with more frequent or more severe fires, the result can be failed regeneration. So both black and white spruce have been found to exhibit reduced post-fire regeneration when multiple fires and moisture stress reduce the presence of viable seeds. And this is showing some work by my colleague Alan Whitman at CFS. And then this synthesis work that was just recently published in PNAS by Jen Baltzer at Wilfrid Laurier showed that regeneration failure and alternative vegetation trajectories have been common in the Western Boreal Plains. So we are already starting to see evidence of these ecosystem transitions. But so warmer and drier climates, when catalyzed by disturbance, can lead to these ecosystem transitions from one state to another. And these types of changes have already started to be observed through remote sensing and satellite imagery. This is for the Northwest Boreal region using satellite data for a 30-year period. And a lot of the conifer forest loss can be attributed to either fire or permafrost thaw in the north. And this widespread conifer loss has been accompanied by gains in deciduous forest, shrub, and herbaceous cover. And the trend is very much in line with what we project from these types of models that I mentioned earlier, these ecoregional or shift models. And so there have been several efforts to model how these fire-mediated vegetation transitions might unfold. And these maps, I'm not going to focus on them too long, but they're from my work a few years ago with colleagues with the fire group, combining bioclimatic vegetation projections with a fire growth model called BURN-P3, which suggested, again, under a high-end greenhouse gas scenario, that we have the potential for broad-scale fire-mediated vegetation transitions. And this is loss of mixedwood and conifer forest in particular, short-term gains in deciduous, potentially long-term loss. So note that, so these maps are hopefully a bit extreme if we're, thinking that we're not getting to this RCP 8.5. But so I did look at a range of future fire scenarios, and the most constrained one suggested, still with this high-end climate scenario, an approximately 50% loss by the end of the century of conifer and mixedwood forest. And this is the lower right-hand panel. And so it was, obviously a first-order projection, but it does tend to agree with other independent evaluations of forest loss due to the strong influence of drought and fire in the future. And so the graph on the right is from another modeling effort that I was involved in. It's a forest landscape simulation exercise using the Landis landscape model, looking at future growth and succession of different species. And both ended up, under this high-end greenhouse gas scenario, it ends up with a similar conclusion of, potential for up to 50% forest loss. Fortunately, less so under the lower scenarios, but still high loss on the conifer end of, on the conifer side. And so those models were applied to bird models and suggesting, of course, accompanying declines in species that are associated with older coniferous forests in particular and mixedwood forest stands. And so these species associated with older forests had the highest projected decreases, whereas species associated with treeless habitats had the highest projected increases. And this kind of exercise has also been done for caribou, moose, white-tailed deer. And so, we know that there's a lot of potential, change in biodiversity associated with really vegetation change. And so we know that to some degree, it's going to be necessary to anticipate and facilitate this inevitable change rather than trying to resist it. And this figures from a paper in Science a few years ago that compares a resistance approach to management on top with one that actively manages an anticipated transition in forest types. And so the resistance strategy may work until, some critical threshold is reached through disturbance, but in the long term, it could result in reduced biodiversity or ecosystem services. So we need to think about when to resist and when to manage transition. But I think it's important to note that landscapes are heterogeneous, and some areas may be naturally buffered from the effects of climate change, either because they're cooler and wetter than their surroundings, and this is not captured in the climate models, or because they're less likely to be influenced by disturbance. And so in these areas that we call refugia, resistance can actually be a more appropriate strategy. And so as the diagram on the right illustrates, this is from a recent paper that we published in Frontiers. This was the result of 30 boreal scientists coming up with a framework. We identified a variety of processes at different scales that can contribute to refugia potential. And of course, the effects can vary by species. And the paper was part of a special issue on refugia that was in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. And refugia can be referred to also as slow lanes for biodiversity. This is a term that's borrowed from the field of paleoecology. And refugia refers to the places where one or more species have persisted through major climatic changes, like, for example, the Pleistocene ice ages in the past. So we're taking ideas from paleoecology and applying them to anthropogenic climate change. And so if we think about refugia, this can include large, long-term macro-refugia, where ecosystems are maintained over large areas and long time periods, or more localized micro-refugia, where local conditions are sufficiently decoupled from regional climates to allow localized persistence. And then, so for management purposes, it's probably most relevant to focus on an intermediate decadal to century time scale and a local to landscape spatial scale. And we know that disturbance processes will be an important part of how ecosystems transition and or not. And so getting broad scale for a little bit here, most fundamentally, refugia potential is high where you have a low magnitude of climate change. So that ecosystems are experiencing less change. And this is, areas that are farther south or along the coast. This is quite broad scale, so it's not that useful. But, depending on how you look at climate change and what variables you look at, Alberta is kind of intermediate in that regard. More locally, refugia potential tends to be high where terrain diversity is high. And so that a greater diversity of climates can be found in a smaller area. And also species can track climate change without moving too far, for example, up hillsides or mountain slopes. And so the concept of climate velocity is really a function of these two things, rate of change and terrain diversity. And climate velocity is low when terrain diversity is high relative to the rate of change. So it makes for a good integrated metric of a refugia potential. These are very macro scale data sets, which we are also in the process of downscaling in some regions, but they can be found at Adapt West, at the Adapt West data portal, and also the Climate NA climate projections that Mark referenced earlier are also there. So you can get the climate change projections and then also some of these more derived metrics of local vulnerability. Oops. Let me just, I don't know why somehow my advancing, all of a sudden I can't advance. Okay, there we go. There we go. But refugia are also related to ecological thresholds and range limits of species. And so that's why this concept is really important at the southern edge of the boreal region here in Alberta. And it's the reason that it's really important to ask the question, refugia for what? And so an example on the left is a projection for white spruce, where climate suitability is projected to shift northward from its current potential distribution in gray. And this is from work by Dave Roberts and Andreas Hamann at the U of A. And so we can think about areas of overlap between current and future distributions or close proximity as refugia for individual species or ecosystems. And we've developed a slightly more sophisticated index of this based on climate velocity to map refugia for individual species and ecosystems. And so we can combine this index across species, as I've done here in these maps. And this is based on tree species distributions by my colleague Dan McKenney. On the left, and then songbird distributions on the right. And you can see, depending on what species you look at, you really have different areas that are resilient based on those species niches. So that's important to consider. But I know you're thinking, well, this is awfully broad, and they are. And so they miss these broad scale distribution models, and the global climate models that we're using to drive them are really coarse. And so they miss a lot of sources of resilience that really aren't easily modeled. And so and that was part of the motivation for this framework, this conceptual framework that we developed. And so we differentiated there between the mechanisms of climate buffering based on, I don't know why my advancing is sometimes, I just wanted to show the, there we go. So we differentiated between the mechanisms of climate buffering that are based on either terrain characteristics or ecological inertia, and disturbance avoidance or fire refugia. And so we know from the scientific literature that north-facing slopes, steep canyons, and lake shores can be cooler than their surroundings. And we know that peatlands have these internal feedback mechanisms that retain water locally, and that forest canopies can buffer temperatures. But we don't know enough yet about the strength or extent of these influences across landscapes, especially in the Western Boreal region. So we need a bit more research, and that's where my research program comes in, and many others. And the group that I'm working with is using a combination of field-based and satellite-based data to measure how ecosystems have responded to climate stressors in the past, in addition to models to simulate future climate change scenarios. And so satellite imagery is, of course, a powerful way to detect change. And we're looking at how vegetation indices respond to drought by relating a Landsat-based greenness index. This is on NDVI. This is the NDVI index. We looked at others as well, but this one was the one that was most sensitive to annual climate moisture by using the climate moisture index. And so just looking at this general map, which is still preliminary, the areas in red are those areas that have been more sensitive to drought over the last 20 years, and in terms of vegetation responses that we can detect remotely. And then areas in yellow are exhibiting a negligible response, and areas in blue are actually responding somewhat positively to drier conditions. And so we still have a bit of work to do to evaluate the underlying drivers of these patterns and to field validate them. But we think when we do that, it could be a useful tool for managers. It's pretty fine scale, especially when we combine it with other sources of information about vulnerability and resilience. And so field measures are also important to help us understand refugia processes. As part of a grad student who I'm co-supervising named Cesar Estevo, as part of his PhD project at the U of A, we deployed inexpensive temperature sensors in areas of terrain variability, focused on river valleys and hill systems, to quantify how much topography and vegetation buffer temperatures. We've also have a bunch of temperature sensors out in peatland dominated landscapes. We don't have that data back yet. But relative to latitude and elevation, the effects were small of the effects of microtopography and vegetation, but they did, when added up, they amounted to a few degrees of difference in temperature, both mean, max, and min. And so Cesar was able to use these relationships to develop predictive spatial models, which we can then use to kind of downscale climate NA, which is relatively coarse for these types of processes. And so this is we only have the data to do this in a few areas, but we're looking to expand our capacity to produce these kind of downscaled climate surfaces. And in addition to directly buffering the effects of drought and temperature increases, refugia may take the form of delayed disturbance effects, as I mentioned. And so that's to say that a healthy forest may have enough ecological inertia to withstand these increases in temperature as long as mature trees remain. And so areas known as fire refugia, which are less likely to burn, are the places that we may have more opportunity to support forests for a longer period of time. And there has been a bit of work on this front that we're contributing to. And this is work by a master's student, Christine Kuntzman at the U of A, who looked at the factors that predict fire severity and fire refugia, defined here as unburned islands within with lower severity. Unburned islands within fires. And so she found, not surprisingly, that bogs and fens had burned with lower severity as measured by the relativized burn ratio from Landsat imagery. And they were also more likely to constitute unburned islands, especially fens. But in addition to just that local effect, she found that the proportion in the landscape of bogs and fens reduced the severity of fires in surrounding upland forests as well. Although the severity, this effect, reduced severity effect was stronger in wetter years. And so as part of her work, she also developed these predictive maps of fire severity. And refugia probability. The map here is showing a higher refugia potential in the blue colors. And so she is defending in December, and eventually these types of maps will also be available when after they're peer reviewed. And so, we still have a lot of scientific questions to answer, but we're starting to generate some of these spatial products and information about refugia that can hopefully start to inform forest planning decisions. And so broadly speaking, though, we think that information about forest vulnerability can be used to inform which management strategies are best used in which places. And clearly, as other speakers have mentioned, one size does not fit all. So this conceptual figure from our paper, I think it can be used to think about how management decisions could differ depending on where you are in relation to, specifically in this part of the world, the boreal prairie transition zone and potential refugia features at the microscale like peatlands and varied terrain. And so in areas where boreal climate conditions are expected to persist more broadly, showing current and future boreal conditions there in the kind of gray color, then forestry practices may not need to change as much, but also conservation investments will be warranted to protect biodiversity more efficiently in these places. So combined effort there. In areas that are projected to transition to parkland or grassland climates, forests can be managed to help that transition. Sorry, so my next one, there we go. But in areas, so we focus there on a more of transition type of forestry. But still areas that are thought to be more locally resilient to these changes, to climate change, we can employ various types of conservation measures or resistance strategies at the local scale. And so here's kind of my attempt to put together some of the strategies in a matrix of climate vulnerability mapped against spatial scale. So I think these are arguably the two key factors in considering how to apply refugia and resilience information to forest management. And so the blue side of the box here represents the refugia end of the vulnerability spectrum. And so in terms of forestry mechanisms, we can think about land use planning at the broader scales, forest management plans at the more intermediate scale, and operational activities at a local scale. And so for areas with high refugia potential, like it's shown on the blue end of the spectrum here, hands-off conservation mechanisms can be an efficient way to conserve biodiversity and ecosystem services where they are most likely to persist long-term. At the regional scales, this may take the form of conservation areas or differences in harvest scheduling, either delayed or accelerated, depending on the goal of, for example, reducing insect damage in one case. At more local scales, you could look at things like riparian buffers, which are already accounted for, but then strategically placed patch retention, potentially combined for greater effectiveness. And then having advancing issues again. Okay, here we go. For these high vulnerability areas, which cover a large part of Alberta, it probably makes more sense to focus on transition strategies, many of which have received a lot of attention and discussion already. And at regional scales, but of course with local implementation, there's a lot of talk about seed zone transfers and potentially even planting of new species entirely as an important strategy for future forests to be best adapted to climate change. And other mechanisms can be used to facilitate the transition to more deciduous dominated forests in this case, and to make forests less flammable. So looking at potentially shorter rotations, strategic salvage logging, deciduous planting, and tending. And then in between these two ends of the spectrum are management tools that may generally promote climate resilience through landscape diversity. And so these strategies are more about bed hedging. So for example, things like triad forest zoning, where the forest is managed in zones of different intensity, may be important to balance productivity with conservation as yields decline. The integration of forestry and wildfire management practices can achieve fuel reduction goals while also protecting fire refugia from severe wildfires or other important values. And intensive site preparation, mounding and planting and so forth can be used strategically to promote, for example, spruce regeneration in the most suitable areas while letting other areas evolve more naturally. And so these are really just ideas that are open for discussion. And of course, I'm very interested in your insights as forestry professionals on all of these topics. These are just kind of suggestions for consideration. And so, in fact, as part of the research group that I'm involved with at the U of A, it's a collaboration between U of A, ABMI, and CFS. We're going to be providing an opportunity for more in-depth discussion, as well as providing additional research results that are being analyzed right now. So we're planning this workshop in February, and I welcome your participation. And so please feel free to send me an email if you're interested in participating in that. And so just to recap briefly, I think, my take-home messages can be summarized pretty briefly here. First of all, given rapid rates of change that we're expecting and indeed experiencing already, it's increasingly important to identify areas of relative resistance or refugia. Landscape heterogeneity creates the potential for micro-refugia, which will be especially important for adaptation, I think. And finally, I would argue from the standpoint of efficiency, biodiversity conservation, and forest stewardship, that forest management strategies and their intensity should depend on refugia and resilience potential. With that, I'll thank my collaborators, co-authors, funding sources, and partners, and thank you for your attention. And I'm going to end this with this slide here just to remind people about to contact me if you're interested. Thank you very much. Okay, maybe I should stop sharing. Okay, so I am now looking at I see here a question in the chat from Phil Como. In connection with the work by Estebo, has there been any examination of effects of soil drainage, soil moisture regime? No, we haven't done that. And we do hope to look at that specifically in this work on peatland dominated landscapes, where we're looking at different soil drainage categories and different underlying surficial geology and drainages. So that will hopefully be a factor that can be incorporated into that future work or the ongoing work that we'll talk about at the upcoming workshop. Thanks for that question. I think, Hudson, I'll let you take over, but I'll probably turn off my camera if that's it.
Okay, so I'm not sure if Hudson is supposed to somewhat transition between Deanna and myself. but
Not sure.
maybe not. I'll go ahead then if we don't hear from him. So let me see if I can share my screen here for everybody. Okay, so that should be good. So yeah, so my name's Juha Metsaranta, and as mentioned at the beginning, I'm a scientist at the Canadian Forest Service, and I will talk to you guys today about an initiative that we're undertaking, looking at environmentally sensitive growth and yield models in Canadian forestry. And I just want to acknowledge my colleagues here, Derek Sattler, Joanne White, Matthew Fortan, and Werner Kurtz, as well as Margaret Penner, who if you're in the growth and yield world, some of you may know that name. She's provided us a little bit of assistance on this particular project. So I actually have very few graphs today in this presentation. It's more of like, I would call this kind of a, maybe a little bit of a description of a problem and then sort of a suggested call to action. So what I have here in this first slide is a series of assertions, I guess. The first one being that in sustainable forest management, we require reliable projections of the future forests. So this includes all aspects. So this could be growing stock in terms of wood or biomass, and those things translated into carbon, and then, or you could imagine habitat for species, and then all other sort of ecosystem services. So we've experienced, as we know, through climate change, a changing environment. So this is, not just temperature and precipitation, but also the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then other factors like the atmospheric deposition of nitrogen and such things. And so this has had an effect on the forests, which we could think of in terms of the growth of trees, tree mortality, the recruitment of new trees to replace trees that have died. Are they the same? Is this occurring? Are the same species or different species? And the species composition of the forest in the future, all of those could change. And these are not new questions. We've been examining these questions for a long time. And despite that, sort of the magnitude and the direction of forest responses to these environmental changes and their relative importance are still somewhat uncertain, even though we've been trying to look at this question for a long time. But the one thing that's clear is that the models that we use, which are based on past observations, may no longer be reliable in terms of the predictions they make about the future. So I guess then the next slide here, I want to define what we mean by a climate or environmentally sensitive growth model. So there's two terms there. So we consider growth and yield kind of to be predictions of tree growth, mortality, and recruitment, which we generate from certain input data and a series of component equations or models. And this will produce output and various indicators of interest that includes wood, not traditionally has been wood volume, but now we might be interested in more in biomass and ecosystem production, which translates into carbon, as well as maybe some harvested wood products and their characteristics that we might expect to extract. And then we define climate sensitive or environmentally sensitive to mean the ability of models like this to consider in the projections the impacts of changes in climate and other environmental conditions. So this would include things like temperature, precipitation, water balance, and things I mentioned before, like increases in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide and other factors. So when we think about like the relationship between the environment and the growth and mortality of trees, we have two related but not identical questions. We might ask scientifically questions around the magnitude and cause of interannual variation in growth and trends in growth. So put simply, are trees growing faster now than they used to? Are they dying sooner? And are the same trees that were there before replacing them? Or are they different? And so there are many studies like this. I've got one here that is a relatively thorough and recent review. And the results of studies like this are not always consistent. So whether the answers to these kinds of questions depend on the region of Canada, the species you're considering, the data that you use to answer the question, and the method of analysis. There's some commonalities that do come out, but there's still, you can get variation in the results. So then the next real question is, can we create models to explain these observations and use these models to make predictions that are relevant to sustainable forest management? So here, I guess this is where I see that there's an opportunity, because we're having an increasing amount of data that we can throw at this problem, and more data sets are coming. So for example, it was already mentioned that we now have many different sources of climate and weather data, including forecasts and interpolations. We have increasing numbers of national scale compilations of tree growth and mortality from permanent sample plots, as well as tree ring observations and other observations. And there's there's remote sensing data that can be used to inform this problem. And we have, our computing capability to deal with large data sets and complex simulations. Monte Carlo simulations is increasing. And the analytical approaches that we have for trying to tease out the messages from data are getting better. So I guess it's not, I just want to mention here that understanding and predicting future growth of forests is not just important for sustainable forest management, it's also important, and this is where my organization, the Canadian Forest Service, is interested in questions like this, where we know that not all of the greenhouse gases that we emit to the atmosphere stay in the atmosphere. We have this sink in terrestrial systems. And the question we ask is that, can this sink be maintained or enhanced through natural climate solutions? And so, we have these commitments to sort of keep warming underneath certain thresholds, and we've made commitments to sort of achieve net zero emissions, and forests will contribute to this. But forests are also at risk from climate change impacts, for example, the increased area burned by wildfire and such things. So to make these kinds of predictions of what the benefits of, that you might get from forests and solutions like this, you need credible data and tools that need to account for the fact that productivity of forests will change in the future. So the context of why the Canadian Forest Service is interested in this, and why people like myself are involved, is that we operate the Canada's National Forest Carbon Monitoring, Accounting and Reporting System, which has at its core sort of the CBM CFS3 model, which some of you may be familiar with or have used in different contexts. So the key input to this system is all of the provincial timber wood supply data that are used in provincial wood supply analysis for forest management. And this includes the forest inventory, kind of the vector polygon map of stands, and also the yield curves that are generated by empirical growth and yield models from provinces and territories, which are not climate and environmentally sensitive at the present time. And we've received criticism from various places that we are not accounting for these changes, and how does that affect our estimates and our projections. So along these lines, so what we've had, and I don't have a picture of this in the slide, but from our organization, we had a forest carbon science plan that we sort of directed a lot of our research efforts between 2012 and 2020. And it's sort of, we had a bunch of goals we wanted to achieve, when one of them was to achieve progress in sort of implementing environmentally sensitive growth projections into systems like the NFC Mars. And that's one where we made less progress than we would have hoped for various reasons. So more as we realized that we were going to need to put some more effort into this. And so we started an initiative somewhere around February 2020, right before COVID, to sort of get ourselves organized around this particular topic. So we've done activities, we've had internal workshops. We have an organizational steering committee. We've engaged with experts from each of the provinces and territories through interviews and virtual workshops. And we've engaged sort of a third-party consultant to do a literature review and suggest some recommendations of what we might want to do. So the desired outcome of this process is here is sort of this strategic plan for a national level approach to climate sensitive growth modeling and managed and unmanaged forest. And I guess the hope is that this can draw from a diversity of approaches and models and has certain characteristics like modularity, scalability, etc. And so the key thing here is that this is a big problem that we know can't be solved unless there's collaboration. And this is the collaboration is key. So that's within our organization and also with provincial and territorial agencies, and also with academics and other research groups. So I'm going to describe some of the process we did recently to sort of build this collaboration. So in the winter of 2021, we went through this process of interviewing experts from each of the provinces and territories. So these were kind of 1 to 2 hour semi-structured interviews. And my colleague, Derek Sattler, was the one who did most of these, and I participated in some. And so then we asked questions around are climate sensitive growth and yield models a research or policy priority in your jurisdiction? And if so, what is the general approach you're taking? Are there major gaps? And who are you collaborating with now? And and if you aren't, then who do you want to collaborate with? The objective of this was to sort of build a picture of the current status of this climate sensitive growth modeling work in Canadian forest management. So I can highlight some of the highlights of that. There's a whole series of additional information here, but these are the main highlights. So on the first question, there was this recognition across all provinces and territories that climate change is affecting forestry, and that there's a need to do something about it, whether in terms of planning or adaptation, mitigation, reporting. And this is recognized at both senior and operational levels. But in terms of, there's often, in terms of taking that concern and translating it into work on trying to improve sort of the growth projections, there's often few new resources and little action or coordination around doing that. And then, along these, I've combined the next two questions here, but so all of the provinces and territories, as we probably well know, are maintaining growth and yield models, which are their systems of components, and they use them for wood supply. And some are investigating using and or localizing other models from different jurisdictions, but none have the climate or environmentally sensitive growth model that's used operationally. And the capacity to develop new models is usually limited. There are some efforts. So, for example, in some provinces, there's efforts to add climate sensitivity to some components of models, like site index. And there's also effort put in to maintain the permanent sample plot network and various trials that could be of help in this regard, I guess, and also as well to sort of improve inventory, particularly enhanced forest inventories. But in each case, the people that we spoke with to do this process are willing to they are collaborating, but are willing to further collaborate with each other, universities, the CFS, other research groups and cooperatives, and this includes sharing data, approaches, and results. So there is definitely a willingness to work together, was expressed almost universally. So, like I said, so part of this we sort of prepared engaged a third-party consultant to prepare a report out of this. So the results, main recommendations are sort of outlined in this slide. So to just reiterate, all provinces are concerned with and with climate change and its effect on the future forest, and are interested in continuing national level discussion, but there's no currently operational model that can project growth under different climate scenarios. The recommendation was that the CFS should try to coordinate this, the development of a national scale model that can do this, but under the condition that it's complementary to what provinces and territories are doing. So there's the recommendation that we should develop a national action plan, continue to have regular meetings with provinces and territories, and continue our own efforts to sort of compile data and models. And we've been doing some of those things on an ongoing basis. And then the other one here is that a next step we could take is to host some sort of a science summit that includes academics and research groups. And this would clearly include working with some of the people I think who are in the audience here that are already working on this problem in Alberta. And some of those conversations have started and will hopefully be ongoing. So where we're at now is that, so we have developed and written like an almost complete sort of pretty good first draft of what we would consider sort of a roadmap for developing this climate sensitive growth model for Canada. And our next step here is that imminently we will organize our next sort of consultation with the sort of provincial territorial expert committee that we've been speaking to. So that's something that will occur kind of very soon. And you know, I guess the idea is that, and then we can share the results of that with others as well at that point. So in summary, you know, in sustainable forest management, we need reliable projections of the future forest. This includes growth, mortality, and recruitment, as well as disturbances. If we, you know, the existing empirical models that are used in wood supply planning and other things may no longer be reliable because of the environmental changes that have occurred because of climate change already and will occur in the future. So with us in the Canadian Forest Service, our interest in this is driven by our obligation to report internationally on greenhouse gas sources and sinks in the forest sector, but we're also, you know, with our science policy work on carbon and climate change mitigation and many other initiatives can benefit. And just this, an important one here is that solving this problem is something that's going to require open collaboration. It's going to be very difficult or impossible for individuals or small groups to do this alone. And we're leading the development of a strategic national plan, and we're getting, you know, close to being completed, something along that we can share with the community. So I think that's it.
Perfect.
Yeah, I don't know. We might be over time, but I didn't see anybody giving us the hook yet. So
No, I figured we'd let you go. You're running
right.
a bit into the lunch hour, but that's okay. That was great. Yeah. So thanks. Thank you very much, Deanna and Juha. Those are great presentations. I don't see, there was just the one question which I think Deanna already kind of dealt with. So I think what we'll do, since we're about 3 or 4 minutes over, we'll take a break now. We'll stop presenting, and then we will start up again here at 12:30, where we'll hear from Jacob Olinsky. All right, folks, thank you very much, and we will chat with you guys shortly.